I stood in my living room, staring at the for sale sign my own daughter had just hammered into my front lawn. My hands were trembling not from age but from pure disbelief. After 43 years in this house, after raising 3 children within these walls, after every mortgage payment, every repair, every moment of love I'd poured into this home, my daughter Sarah looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, this house isn't really yours anymore. We need the money." But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with that sign in my yard. It starts much earlier, with a woman who believed that putting family first was the most important thing in the world. My name is Emily Patterson, and I'm 72 years old. For the past 4 decades, I've lived in the same colonial house on Maple Street in a quiet suburb outside Chicago. My late husband Robert and I bought that house in 1981 when our eldest daughter Sarah was just 2 years old. It cost us $8,000 then, which felt like a fortune on Robert's teacher's salary and my part-time work as a bookkeeper. I remember the day we signed the papers like it was yesterday. Robert carried me over the threshold while little Sarah clapped her hands, and I stood in that empty living room thinking about all the memories we'd make there. The Christmas mornings, the birthday parties, the scraped knees I'd bandage in the kitchen, the homework sessions at the dining room table. Every dollar of that mortgage payment was worth it because we weren't just buying a house. We were building a home. Over the years, that house became the heart of everything. When Michael was born 3 years later, then Jennifer 2 years after that, our home stretched to accommodate everyone. I painted nurseries, installed safety gates, and turned the basement into a playroom. When the kids got older, I helped with countless school projects at that kitchen table, hosted sleepovers in the family room, and stood on the front porch taking pictures before every prom and graduation. When Robert passed away 8 years ago after a sudden heart attack, the house became even more precious to me. It held every memory of our life together. The spot where he proposed to me in front of the fireplace. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe measuring the children's heights year after year. The garden out back where he taught each of the kids to plant tomatoes. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But here's what I didn't fully understand until that day with the for sale sign. My children had been watching that house appreciate and value their entire lives. What Robert and I bought for $8,000 was now worth nearly $50,000. And somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing it as their childhood home and started seeing it as their inheritance. The trouble began about 6 months before that awful day. Sarah, my eldest, had always been the most practical of my children. She's 45 now, works in finance, and has 2 teenagers of her own. She started coming over more frequently, but not for the warm family visits I initially hoped for. Instead, she'd walk through the house with a critical eye, pointing out things that needed updating. "Mom, this carpet is ancient," she'd say, running her foot along the living room rug that Robert and I had saved up to buy 15 years earlier. "And these kitchen cabinets are so dated. The whole place could use a complete renovation." First, I thought she was just trying to help. Maybe she was worried about me living in an outdated house. But then Michael started joining these conversations. My middle child, now 42, had always struggled financially. He'd gone through a messy divorce 2 years ago and was paying substantial child support. He'd also made some poor investment decisions that had left him in debt. "Mom," Michael said during one of these visits, "have you thought about downsizing? This house is way too big for just you. You could get a nice apartment and have money left over to really enjoy your retirement." Jennifer, my youngest at 40, was the only one who seemed to understand my attachment to the house. She'd often defend me when her siblings brought up selling, saying things like, "It's Mom's house. She should live wherever makes her happy." But even Jennifer had financial pressures. Her husband had been laid off from his construction job, and they were struggling to make ends meet with 3 young children. The conversations became more frequent and more pressing. Sarah started bringing real estate listings to show me condos and retirement communities. Michael would calculate out loud how much money I could have if I sold and moved somewhere smaller. They'd tag team me during family dinners, working together to convince me that selling was the practical thing to do. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this," Sarah would say in her no-nonsense tone. "You're being sentimental about a house. At your age, you should be thinking about your future care needs. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you can't maintain this place anymore?" I tried to explain that the house wasn't just an asset to me. It was my sanctuary, my connection to Robert, my anchor to all our family memories. But every time I brought up the emotional significance, they'd dismiss it as impractical thinking. The pressure intensified over the following months. They started involving their spouses in the campaign. Sarah's husband Tom, who works in real estate, began giving me uninvited assessments of my home's value and market conditions. Michael's girlfriend Lisa would make comments about how much my grandchildren could benefit from their share of the inheritance. Even Jennifer's husband eventually joined in, suggesting that selling would give me freedom from home maintenance responsibilities. It felt like an orchestrated campaign, and I began to dread family gatherings because I knew they'd inevitably turn into sales pitches for why I should give up my home. They made me feel selfish for wanting to stay in the house where I'd spent my entire adult life, where I'd raised them, where I felt closest to their father's memory. The breaking point came on a Sunday in early November. All three of my children had come over for what I thought was just a normal family dinner. I'd spent the morning cooking Robert's famous pot roast recipe, setting the dining room table with my good china, and looking forward to a pleasant afternoon with my family. But halfway through dinner, Sarah cleared her throat and said, "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation with you. We've been doing some research, and we think it's time for you to face reality about this house." Michael nodded and pulled out a folder of papers. "We've been looking into your finances, Mom. Your savings won't last forever, especially with inflation and potential healthcare costs. This house is your biggest asset, and you're not being responsible by refusing to access that equity." I felt my stomach drop. "You've been looking into my finances? What do you mean by that?" Jennifer looked uncomfortable but didn't speak up to defend me. Sarah leaned forward with the expression she used to wear when lecturing her own teenagers. "Mom, we're your children. We have a right to understand your financial situation because it affects all of us. If something happens to you and you haven't properly planned, we'll be the ones dealing with the consequences." "We've talked to a financial advisor," Tom added, speaking as if he had any authority in my personal matters. "Given your age and fixed income, you should really consider liquidating this asset while the market is strong." Michael opened his folder and started spreading papers across my dining room table, right over the place settings I'd so carefully arranged. "Look, Mom. Here are some assisted living facilities with great ratings. And here are some nice condos closer to Sarah that would be much more manageable for you." I stared at those papers scattered across my table and felt something inside me snap. "Stop," I said quietly. They didn't hear me and kept talking, pointing at different listings and discussing my life as if I weren't even there. "Stop," I said louder, and finally they looked at me. "Mom, don't get upset," Jennifer said gently. "We're just trying to help you plan for the future." "Help me plan?" I stood up from my chair, my hands shaking with anger. "You're not helping me plan anything. You're planning for me without me, as if I don't have a say in my own life." Sarah's expression hardened. "Mom, you're being emotional and impractical. We're your family, and we're trying to look out for your best interests." "My best interests?" I looked around the table at my three children, these people I devoted my life to raising, and realized they weren't seeing me as their mother anymore. They were seeing me as an obstacle to their inheritance. "Yes, your best interests," Michael said firmly. "And frankly, Mom, we're not going to stand by and watch you make poor decisions that affect all of us." That's when Sarah delivered the blow that changed everything between us forever. "Mom," she said, looking me directly in the eyes with cold determination, "this house isn't really yours anymore. Emotionally, maybe, but practically speaking, it's family property. It's our inheritance, and you're being selfish by refusing to make rational decisions about it." The room went completely silent. Even Tom and Lisa looked uncomfortable with how blunt Sarah had been. Jennifer opened her mouth as if to say something but closed it again without speaking. "Not mine anymore?" I repeated slowly. "That's not what she meant," Michael said quickly, shooting Sarah a warning look. But then he continued. "What she means is that you need to start thinking about this house as part of our family's financial future, not just your personal attachment." But I knew exactly what Sarah had meant. In her mind, I was already gone. I was just a temporary caretaker of property that rightfully belonged to them. My 43 years of mortgage payments, my decades of love and memories within these walls, my connection to Robert's spirit that I felt most strongly here. None of that mattered compared to their financial interests. I sat back down at my dining room table, looking at my children as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. These weren't the loving, grateful adults I'd raised. These were people who'd calculated the value of my life down to real estate equity, and were impatient for me to get out of their way. "I think you should all leave now," I said quietly. "Mom, don't be dramatic," Sarah said with exasperation. "We're trying to have an adult conversation here." "The conversation is over," I said, standing up again. "Please leave my house." "Mom, come on," Michael protested. "We drove all the way over here to help you work through this. You drove over here to pressure me into giving up my home," I corrected him. "And I'm asking you to leave. Now." They gathered up their papers with obvious frustration. Sarah was the last to head toward the door, and she turned back to me with a look of cold disappointment. "Mom, you're going to have to face reality eventually. We won't let you make decisions that hurt this family." After they left, I sat alone in my dining room, staring at my good china still set for a family dinner that had turned into an ambush. The pot roast was growing cold, and the house felt impossibly quiet. For the first time in 8 years, I actually felt grateful that Robert wasn't alive to see what our children had become. But that dinner was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the pressure campaign intensified dramatically. Sarah started calling me daily, always with the same message. I needed to be reasonable about the house. Michael began dropping by unannounced, usually with new listings or financial projections about why selling made sense. They enlisted other family members in their cause. My sister Margaret called me from Arizona, clearly having been coached by Sarah. "Emily, honey, the kids are just worried about you rattling around in that big house all by yourself. Maybe it is time to think about something smaller and more manageable." Even my grandchildren started making comments that were clearly planted by their parents. Sarah's 16-year-old daughter Brittany said to me during one visit, "Grandma, Mom says you might move somewhere smaller. That could be fun, right? Like an adventure." But what hurt the most was Jennifer's gradual shift from defending me to joining her siblings' campaign. I understood she was under pressure from her husband and probably felt caught between loyalty to me and her own family's financial needs. But when she stopped speaking up for me entirely, I felt truly alone. The situation escalated dramatically in early December. I came home from grocery shopping to find Sarah's car in my driveway, and Sarah herself standing in my living room with a man I didn't recognize. "Mom, perfect timing," Sarah said brightly, as if it were completely normal for her to be in my house without permission. "This is David Chun. He's a real estate agent, and I asked him to take a look at the house to give us a professional assessment." I set my grocery bags down heavily on the kitchen counter. "You brought a real estate agent into my house without asking me?" David looked uncomfortable and started to back toward the door. "Mrs. Patterson, I think there might be some confusion here. Your daughter said you were interested in listing the property." "There's no confusion," I said firmly. "I am not selling my house. I did not invite you here, and I'd appreciate it if you'd leave immediately." After David left, Sarah and I had our most explosive argument yet. She accused me of being stubborn and irrational. I accused her of being manipulative and disrespectful. The argument ended with Sarah storming out, but not before delivering an ultimatum. "Mom, I'm done trying to reason with you. If you won't make the smart decision, we're going to have to make it for you." I didn't fully understand what she meant until the next day, when Michael showed up at my door with a folder full of legal documents. "Mom, we've been talking to an attorney," he said, not even asking if he could come in. "We're concerned about your decision-making capacity, and we think it might be time to explore guardianship options." My blood ran cold. "Guardianship? It's not what it sounds like," he said quickly. "It would just be a way to ensure that you have help making important financial decisions. Sarah has power of attorney already, but this would give us more authority to act in your best interests if you're not thinking clearly." I stared at my middle child. This man I'd supported through 2 decades of poor choices and financial mistakes, and realized he was threatening to have me declared incompetent so they could force me out of my own home. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, just look at the paperwork. We're trying to protect you. Get out of my house right now, or I'm calling the police." He left, but I knew this wasn't over. They weren't just pressuring me anymore. They were actively plotting to take control of my life and my property. That night, I sat in Robert's old chair in the living room, looking around at the walls covered with family photos, thinking about how those smiling faces in the pictures had become people I barely recognized. My children weren't evil people, but somewhere along the way, they'd started seeing me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I realized that all those years I'd spent putting their needs first, making sacrifices for their education and their dreams, teaching them that family comes before everything else. Somehow I'd raised children who thought that lesson only applied to me. They expected me to continue sacrificing for their benefit, but they felt no obligation to consider my feelings or wishes in return. That's when I started making phone calls of my own. The first call was to my attorney, James Morrison, who'd handled Robert's estate and had been a family friend for over 20 years. I explained the situation and Jim was appalled. "Emily, they absolutely cannot pursue guardianship unless there's clear evidence of cognitive decline or inability to manage your affairs," he assured me. "And from everything I can see, you're as sharp as you've ever been. They're trying to intimidate you into compliance." The second call was to my financial advisor, Patricia Wells. I'd been conservative with my investments over the years, but I wanted to understand exactly what resources I had available to me. What Patricia told me was enlightening. "Emily, you're in much better financial shape than you might realize," she said. "Between Robert's pension, your Social Security, the life insurance payout, and your savings and investments, you have substantial assets. You're not dependent on your children at all, and you have more options than you might think." The third call was to my banker, Helen Rodriguez, who'd handled my accounts for 15 years. I explained that I was considering some major financial decisions and wanted to understand my borrowing capacity, given my assets and equity. What I learned from these conversations was that while my children saw me as a burden to be managed, the financial world saw me as a woman with substantial assets and excellent credit who'd been making sound decisions for decades. But the most important call I made was to my old friend Dorothy Williams. Dorothy and I had been neighbors when my children were young, before she moved across town to a larger house. We'd stayed in touch over the years, and she'd always been someone I could count on for honest advice. "Emily, honey, what's really going on?" Dorothy asked after I'd given her the basic outline of my situation. "I think I raised selfish children, Dorothy," I admitted. "And now I don't know what to do about it." "You raised normal children who became adults with their own financial pressures," Dorothy said wisely. "But that doesn't give them the right to bully you out of your home. What you do about it depends on how far you're willing to go to stand up for yourself." "What do you mean?" "Well, you could just give in and let them push you around for the rest of your life. Or you could show them that their mother is stronger and smarter than they've given her credit for." That conversation with Dorothy planted a seed that grew into the most audacious plan of my entire life. I started quietly researching real estate in my neighborhood. Maple Street had always been a desirable area, with well-maintained homes and a strong sense of community. Most of my neighbors were families who'd lived there for decades, just like Robert and I had. But I noticed something interesting as I looked at recent sales data. Several houses on my street had sold in the past year, and some were currently on the market. The more I looked into it, the more intrigued I became. My house at 847 Maple Street was worth approximately $50,000. The house next door at 849 had sold 6 months ago for $25,000. The house across the street at 848 was currently listed for $80,000. 2 houses down at 851 had just gone on the market for $95,000. I started taking long walks around my neighborhood, really paying attention to which houses had for sale signs and what condition they were in. I talked to neighbors I'd known for decades, asking casual questions about who was moving and why. What I discovered was that several longtime residents were downsizing or moving to be closer to adult children, creating an unusual number of available properties on my street. That's when the plan began to form in my mind. It was audacious, maybe even crazy, but it was also brilliant in its simplicity. If my children thought my house wasn't really mine anymore, if they saw it as family property they had a right to control, then maybe it was time to show them what real property ownership looked like. I started by making an offer on 848 Maple Street, the house directly across from mine. It was listed for $80,000, but the sellers were motivated to move quickly. I offered $65,000 cash, contingent on a quick closing. My offer was accepted within 2 days. Next, I approached the elderly couple at 851 Maple Street. They just listed their house but were nervous about the selling process. I offered them $10,000 cash with a 30-day closing, and they accepted immediately. The house at 845 Maple Street wasn't even officially on the market yet, but I'd heard through neighborhood gossip that the owners were planning to sell in the spring. I knocked on their door and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. $25,000 cash for a December closing, eliminating their need to go through the stress and uncertainty of listing their house. Within 3 weeks, I had purchased 3 houses on my street for a combined total of $0.9 million. And I wasn't done yet. The whole time I was making these purchases, my children continued their campaign of pressure and intimidation. Sarah called daily with new arguments about why I should sell. Michael continued dropping by with legal documents and threats about guardianship. Jennifer had stopped communicating with me directly, working through her siblings to convey messages about how worried she was about my stubbornness. They had no idea what I was doing. To them, I was just a stubborn old woman clinging irrationally to a house that should rightfully be converted to cash for their benefit. They couldn't see that I was actually making the most significant financial moves of my entire life. The closings were scheduled throughout December, and I used a law firm downtown rather than my usual attorney to keep everything confidential. I paid cash for all 3 properties, using a combination of my savings, investment liquidations, and a substantial loan secured by my original house and the equity in the new properties. By December 23rd, I owned 4 houses on Maple Street, including my original home. I controlled nearly an entire city block in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in our suburb. That's when I decided it was time to have another family meeting. I called each of my children and invited them over for Christmas Eve dinner, just like we'd done every year since Robert passed away. I spent the morning cooking all their favorite dishes, setting the table with my finest china, and preparing for the most important conversation of my life. They arrived within minutes of each other, which told me they'd coordinated their approach. Sarah came armed with new financial projections and retirement home brochures. Michael brought more legal documents. Even Jennifer had prepared what sounded like a rehearsed speech about wanting me to be safe and happy. We made it through dinner with only minor skirmishes about my unreasonable attachment to the house. But as I served dessert, Sarah launched into what was clearly their planned final assault. "Mom, we've been patient with you, but this has to stop," she began. "We've done extensive research, and keeping this house simply doesn't make financial sense for someone in your position." Michael nodded and opened his familiar folder. "We've found a beautiful retirement community just 20 minutes from Sarah's house. You'd have your own apartment, but with meal service and healthcare support available. And you'd have enough money left over from the house sale to live comfortably for the rest of your life." Jennifer finally spoke up, though she couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. This house is too big, too much responsibility. Wouldn't you rather spend your time enjoying yourself instead of worrying about maintenance and upkeep?" I listened to their entire presentation without interrupting. When they finished, the dining room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. "Are you done?" I asked quietly. "Mom, we know this is hard to hear, but—" Sarah started. "I asked if you were done," I repeated firmly. They exchanged glances and Sarah nodded. "Yes, we're done. We just need you to understand that this decision affects all of us, and we won't let you make choices that harm this family's financial future." I stood up from my chair and walked to the living room window that looked out onto Maple Street. My children followed me, probably thinking I was going to point out something that needed repair or maintenance. Instead, I pointed across the street to 848 Maple Street. "Do you see that house? What about it?" Michael asked. "I bought it 3 weeks ago. Paid $65,000 cash." The silence that followed was deafening. I turned to face my children and saw expressions of complete shock and confusion. "You what?" Sarah whispered. I pointed down the street to 851 Maple Street. "I bought that one too. $10,000 cash." Then I pointed to 845 Maple Street. "And that one? $25,000 cash." Jennifer was the first to find her voice. "Mom, that's impossible. You don't have that kind of money." "Actually, I do," I said calmly. "I've had that kind of money for years. I just never felt the need to prove it to anyone." Sarah's face had gone completely white. "Mom, what have you done? That's almost $1 million. That's your entire life savings and more. Not my entire life savings, I corrected her. Just most of it. Plus a loan secured by these 4 properties that I now own. Michael was staring at me as if I'd announced I was joining the circus. Mom, this is insane. Why would you buy 3 houses you don't need? I smiled at him, feeling more confident and powerful than I had in months. You told me this house wasn't really mine anymore. You said it was family property. You made me feel like I had no right to make decisions about my own life and my own assets. I walked back to the dining room table and picked up the folder of legal documents Michael had brought. You threatened me with guardianship proceedings. You brought real estate agents into my house without permission. You treated me like an incompetent old woman who needed to be managed. Sarah was starting to recover from her shock, and I could see anger building in her expression. Mom, buying those houses was completely irresponsible. You've jeopardized your financial security for no good reason. No good reason? I laughed, and the sound surprised even me. I'll tell you what the reason was. You wanted to convince me I was too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs. So I decided to show you exactly how capable I am of managing significant real estate transactions. But why 3 houses? Jennifer asked weakly. Because, I said, looking directly at each of my children in turn, I wanted to demonstrate something very important. You see me as a weak old woman clinging to a house she can't really afford to keep. But what I actually am is a savvy investor who just acquired 4 prime properties in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the area. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for this conversation. Inside were property assessments, rental market analyses, and financial projections that Patricia Wells had helped me compile. These 4 houses have a combined current value of approximately $0.6 million, I explained, spreading the documents on the table where Michael's legal threats had been just an hour earlier. Conservative rental income projections show I can generate approximately $80,000 per year in gross rental income from the 3 houses I'm not living in. Sarah was studying the papers with her finance background, and I could see her doing calculations in her head. Mom, even if the numbers work out, this is incredibly risky for someone your age. What if property values decline? What if you can't find reliable tenants? What if major repairs are needed? Those are excellent questions, I acknowledged. The same kinds of questions you should have asked before deciding that I was incompetent to manage my own financial affairs. Michael was looking increasingly agitated. Mom, this is crazy. You've tied up all your liquid assets in real estate. What if you have a medical emergency? What if you need long-term care? Another great question, I said. Of course, those are exactly the kinds of concerns that would be relevant when someone is trying to pressure me into selling my home and moving into assisted living. But somehow those concerns didn't matter when you thought you could control the decision. Jennifer was crying now, which softened my heart somewhat. She'd always been the most emotional of my children, and I could see she was genuinely distressed. But she was also the one who'd stood by and let her siblings bully me, so my sympathy was limited. Mom, I don't understand, she said through her tears. Why didn't you just tell us you had this much money? Why did you let us worry about your finances? I didn't let you worry about my finances, I corrected her. You decided to worry about my finances because you were worried about your inheritance. There's a difference. That statement hit home, and all 3 of my children looked uncomfortable. Sarah, however, quickly shifted back to attack mode. Mom, regardless of your motivations, this was a reckless decision. You're 72 years old. You have no business taking on this kind of debt and risk. Really? I asked. Because 3 weeks ago, you were telling me I had no business keeping even 1 house. Now that I own 4, suddenly you're concerned about my risk tolerance. I could see that my children were struggling to process this new reality. For months they'd been treating me as if I were a confused, helpless widow who needed their guidance and management. The idea that I could independently execute nearly $1 million in real estate transactions without their knowledge or permission was completely outside their understanding of who I was. But I wasn't finished with my revelations yet. Now let me tell you what's going to happen next, I continued, walking back to my desk to retrieve another folder. I've spent the past 3 weeks not just buying houses, but researching rental markets and tenant screening processes. I handed Sarah a list of rental applications I'd already received. All 3 of the houses I bought are in excellent condition and located in a highly desirable school district. I've already received more than 30 applications from potential tenants, including several families with excellent credit and employment histories. Michael was staring at the applications as if they were written in a foreign language. Mom, you can't seriously be planning to become a landlord at your age. Why not? I asked. You think I'm too old to manage real estate investments, but you thought I was competent enough to move into a retirement community and manage my own finances there? Sarah had been studying my rental market analysis, and I could see her professional skepticism warring with her growing realization that I'd actually done my homework. Mom, even if this works financially, being a landlord is a huge responsibility. What about maintenance issues? What about problem tenants? What about legal issues? I smiled and handed her another set of documents. I've already retained Henderson Property Management to handle day-to-day operations. They'll collect rent, coordinate maintenance, handle tenant issues, and provide me with monthly reports. My involvement will be limited to major decisions and financial oversight. The room fell silent again as my children processed this information. I could see them struggling to reconcile their image of me as a sentimental, impractical old woman with the evidence that I'd planned and executed a sophisticated investment strategy without their help or knowledge. Finally, Sarah looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, I have to ask, why didn't you just tell us you disagreed with our advice? Why go to these extremes to prove a point? I sat down across from her and looked at all 3 of my children. Because you didn't treat me like someone whose opinions mattered. You treated me like an obstacle to your financial plans. You didn't ask what I wanted or how I felt. You told me what was going to happen. We were trying to help, Jennifer protested. No, I said firmly. You were trying to control. There's a difference. I leaned forward and spoke directly to each of them. Sarah, you told me this house wasn't really mine anymore. Michael, you threatened me with guardianship proceedings to force me to comply with your wishes. Jennifer, you stood by and let them bully me instead of defending my right to make my own choices. The truth of my words hung in the air between us. I could see each of them remembering their actions over the past months, perhaps seeing them from my perspective for the first time. So when you said this house wasn't really mine anymore, I continued, I decided to show you what property ownership actually looks like. When you suggested I wasn't competent to manage my affairs, I demonstrated exactly how competent I am. And when you tried to pressure me into giving up my independence, I chose to expand it instead. Michael was shaking his head slowly. But Mom, what's the end game here? You can't really want to be managing rental properties for the next decade. Why not? I asked. You thought I was too old and frail to maintain one house, but I might live another 20 years. What exactly did you think I should be doing with all that time? Sitting in a retirement community apartment watching television and waiting to die. That statement clearly hit home with all of them. I could see them realizing that their concern for my safety and security had really been about reducing me to a manageable, passive role in my own life. Sarah looked down at the financial projections again. Mom, I have to admit, the numbers look solid. If you can maintain occupancy rates and avoid major repairs, this could actually generate substantial income. It could, I agreed. And if I get tired of managing properties, I can sell them. But the important thing is that it will be my choice to make. Jennifer was still crying, but now she looked more frustrated than sad. Mom, why couldn't we have had this conversation months ago? Why did you let us go through all this conflict when you had other options all along? Because you never asked about my other options, I said. You decided what I should do, and then tried to convince me to comply. You never once asked what I wanted or what would make me happy. The conversation continued for another hour, with my children gradually accepting the reality of what I'd done and beginning to understand why I'd done it. Sarah, with her financial background, was the first to admit that my strategy was actually quite sophisticated. Michael took longer to come around but eventually acknowledged that I'd proven my point about competence and independence. Jennifer was hurt that I hadn't trusted her enough to include her in my plans, but she also admitted that she hadn't stood up for me when I needed her support. By the time they left that evening, the dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. They were no longer treating me as a confused widow who needed their management. They were looking at me with something approaching respect for the first time in months. But the real satisfaction came in the weeks that followed. I rented all 3 of my newly purchased houses within 30 days. The first went to a young doctor and her husband who were relocating for her residency at the local hospital. The second went to a military family who needed a temporary home during a 2-year assignment at the nearby base. The third went to a divorced father who wanted his children to be able to stay in the same school district. All 3 families were thrilled to find well-maintained homes in such a desirable neighborhood. The rental income was exactly what I'd projected, and the property management company was handling all the day-to-day details efficiently. But more importantly, the psychological impact of what I'd done was profound. My children stopped treating me as if I were incompetent or irrational. They stopped pressuring me about my housing choices, and they started asking my advice about their own financial decisions. Sarah called me in February to discuss a refinancing decision she was considering. Michael asked for my input when he was thinking about changing jobs. Jennifer started bringing her children over more often, and I could tell she was seeing me as their sharp, capable grandmother rather than a burden to be managed. The neighborhood dynamic changed as well. Word spread quickly about my real estate acquisitions, and I became something of a local legend. Other longtime residents started asking my advice about property values and investment strategies. I was invited to join the neighborhood association board, and my opinion carried weight in community discussions. Most importantly, I felt like myself again for the first time in months. I wasn't a helpless widow clinging to the past. I was a successful investor and property owner who'd made bold, intelligent decisions about my future. By the summer, my properties had appreciated in value and my rental income was exceeding projections. I'd proven not just to my children but to myself that age doesn't automatically equal incompetence, and that experience can be just as valuable as youth when making important decisions. The house at 847 Maple Street was still my beloved family home, filled with memories of Robert and the children's younger years. But now it was also the anchor property in a substantial real estate portfolio that I'd built with my own vision and determination. When I sat in Robert's old chair in the living room now, looking out at the street where I owned 4 homes, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. I'd turned my children's attempt to diminish me into an opportunity to expand my life and capabilities. Sarah stopped by one evening in late summer, ostensibly to check on me but really to apologize for how she'd handled the situation months earlier. "Mom, I owe you an apology," she said as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset. "We were so focused on what we thought was best for you that we forgot to consider what you actually wanted." "You were focused on what was easiest for you," I corrected her gently. "There's a difference." She nodded sadly. "You're right. We saw you as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. And we were wrong." "Yes, you were," I agreed. "But you're learning. And that's what matters now." She looked across the street at one of my rental properties, where the young doctor was planting flowers in the front garden. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Were you ever actually considering selling this house? Or were you always planning something like this?" I thought about her question carefully. "Honestly, Sarah, if you had approached me with respect and kindness, if you had asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I should do, if you had treated me like an intelligent adult instead of a confused child, we might have had a very different conversation about my future." "But we didn't," she said quietly. "No, you didn't. And that's why I had to show you who I really am." As the months passed, my success as a property owner became even more apparent. Property values in the neighborhood continued to rise, my rental income remained strong, and I found that I actually enjoyed the challenge of managing my investments. More importantly, my relationship with my children had been fundamentally reset. They no longer saw me as someone whose decisions they could override or whose life they could manage without consultation. They recognized that I was a competent, independent woman who was perfectly capable of making her own choices about her future. Jennifer brought her children over for Christmas that year, and as I watched them play in the living room where I'd once felt so threatened and dismissed, I realized that my bold action had done more than just secure my housing situation. It had secured my dignity and my role as the family matriarch. The house at 847 Maple Street was still my sanctuary, still filled with memories of Robert and decades of family life. But now it was also proof of my continued relevance and capability. It was the headquarters of a thriving business venture that I'd conceived and executed entirely on my own. When people asked me about my decision to become a real estate investor at 72, I always gave them the same answer. Age is just a number, but respect is earned. My children forgot that I'd been making sound decisions long before they were born, so I had to remind them. The street that had once been just my neighborhood was now my domain. Every morning when I looked out my living room window, I saw not just the place where I'd raised my family, but also the tangible proof of my continued strength and independence. My children had told me that my home wasn't really my own anymore, so I bought the whole street to show them what ownership actually looks like. And in doing so, I reclaimed not just my property, but my power, my dignity, and my rightful place as the head of our family. Some people might call what I did extreme or unnecessary, but those people have never had their own children treat them as if their opinions and feelings didn't matter. They've never been made to feel like a burden or an obstacle to other people's plans for their life. What I did was send a clear message that I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't giving up control of my life. And I certainly wasn't going to be bullied into making decisions that served other people's interests at the expense of my own happiness. The sign that had once made my hands tremble with shock and betrayal was long gone from my front lawn. In its place was a small, elegant sign that read Patterson Properties, established 2024. Every time I saw it, I smiled, remembering the day I decided to stop being a victim of my children's expectations and start being the author of my own story. At 72, I'd learned that it's never too late to surprise people, including yourself. It's never too late to stand up for what you believe in. And it's never too late to show the people who underestimate you exactly what you're capable of achieving. The house at 847 Maple Street was mine, had always been mine, and would remain mine for as long as I chose to live there. But now I also owned 845, 848, and 851 Maple Street, along with the respect of my children, the admiration of my neighbors, and most importantly, the satisfaction of knowing I'd turned their attempt to diminish me into the most empowering chapter of my entire life.